The US and European Union say they've struck a trade deal. It'll impose 15% tariffs for Europe, but not the US, and there are pledges for huge US energy and weapons contracts. EU supporters say it averts a trade war. Critics say it's capitulation. So who's the winner? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. On what was described as a private trip to his golf courses in Scotland, US President Donald Trump still managed to fit in some business between the putting greens on Sunday. Rather important business, in fact, in the shape of a deal with the European Union averting a trade war dreaded by Europe. Trump played hardball as well as golf, warning his visitor, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, that he was not in a good mood and that a deal might not happen. In the end, a meeting lasting just 40 minutes was somehow all it took, despite the complexities and magnitude of what was at stake. It's complex stuff, but a rough summary would be 15% tariffs on the majority of European goods and huge contracts for American weapons and the energy sector. Reaction has been mixed in Europe, relief at averting a trade war, but critics say von der Leyen caved in. A sombre day for Europe, according to France's Prime Minister François Bayrou. So what really happened? Did Trump strong-arm Europe into submission, or have the Europeans won by staving off a trade war? We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first this report from Joel Evans.
For a trip that was billed as a personal visit, US President Donald Trump has achieved something major. After months of negotiations, the United States and the European Union have agreed a trade deal, ending months of standoff and threats of tariffs and countermeasures. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen travelled to Donald Trump's golf course in Turnberry, Scotland on Sunday. Earlier in the day, Trump had warned the chances of an agreement stood at only 50-50. Then, after talks with his European guest, he said the deal had been done.
Thank you very much. So we have good news. We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, I believe. And I think you were saying this is probably the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity, trade or beyond trade.
It is.
The leaders agreed a US tariff of 15% on European goods. That's half of what Donald Trump had threatened if a deal wasn't reached by the beginning of August. Von der Leyen described the deal as huge and one that would bring stability. The US-EU trade relationship is worth $1.9 trillion in goods and services annually. Under the new agreement, the 27-member bloc will open its markets to US exporters with 0% tariffs on certain products. European car makers will now pay 15% in import taxes rather than the 25%, which was introduced in April. The deal will also see the EU increase its investment into the US by $600 billion, while spending $750 billion on strategic purchases including oil, gas, nuclear, as well as microchips and US-made military equipment. But there are sticking points. European steel and aluminium will continue to face a 50% tariff when sold into the US.
On steel and aluminium, the European Union and the US face the common external challenge of global overcapacity. We will work together to ensure fair global competition and to reduce barriers between us.
Both sides are hailing the agreement as a major win, but some critics say this is more of a win for Trump than it is for Brussels.
15% on almost all goods looks like a face-saving compromise for both sides. But when you look at the economics and when you look where we stood at the start of the year, namely with hardly any tariffs, the European Union will clearly lose from this deal. The European Union will see the negative economic impact.
There's been mixed reaction in Germany, the EU's biggest economy. While German Chancellor Friedrich Merz hailed the deal, saying it prevented a trade war, German exporters in the BDI Federation of Industrial Groups said the accord would have considerable negative repercussions. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
To make sense of all of this, let's bring in our guests. In Dublin, David McWilliams, an economist and host of the David McWilliams podcast. In the US state of Maryland, Alan Tonelson, an economic policy analyst and founder of Reality-Chek. That's a blog focusing on economic and national security policies. And in London, Mujtaba Rahman, managing director for Europe at the Eurasia Group, where he leads analysis on transatlantic trade and security. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. So I think the court of public opinion may have already decided this, David, but tough negotiations. Who won?
I think from the US side, it looks better than it is. And from the European side, it will actually turn out less bad than people feared. I think you've got to look at the whole thing in the round. I mean, basically, the European Union has a 200 billion odd trade surplus with the United States. It has much, much more to lose from a trade war by virtue of the fact that it is the dominant trading partner. I also think the Europeans have played for time. I think that basically this is a case of we fight and then we live to fight another day. So although all the immediate reaction is the European Union caved in, I think the European Union folded as you probably would do in a poker game. In a poker game, I think you fold if your hand isn't so good. If you're going to wait, you don't want to gamble all your chips. And I think what they will hope is that Donald J. Trump will go back to America, go in the victory lap, and that will be it. And a 15% tariff, given where we could have ended up, is probably not a bad deal. It also reflects a power struggle within the European Union between the European Commission on the one hand and the member states on the other hand. The member states, Germany, France, my own country, Ireland, have very, very different interests.
Mujtaba, there are some among those member states who think the EU surrendered, notably France's Prime Minister François Bayrou. He said it's a sombre day when an alliance of free peoples resigns itself into submission. Is that how you see it?
I do think the EU ultimately had to surrender, and I don't think the EU had much choice. It wasn't really about the risks on the trade side. I think it was more to do with the vulnerabilities that exist in other geopolitical theatres, in particular, the risk that an escalating tit-for-tat trade war could create potential risks that would, for example, precipitate a unilateral US withdrawal from Ukraine, or we have a forced posture review later in the year where the US will make a decision about which assets it's going to leave in Europe to help protect Europe and which assets it wants to refocus on the Indo-Pacific. And maybe in that context, the drawdown from the US would be greater than is currently expected. And so I think that is really the element that underpinned the Commission's negotiating strategy and drove Ursula von der Leyen's caution. It was the risk that the trade discussion spills out into other theatres where Europe is geopolitically vulnerable. And I think von der Leyen calculated correctly, in my view, that that was not a risk worth contemplating. And so as a result, the EU is now going to eat a 15% tariff wall on all its exports to the US, albeit there will be holes and carve-outs that are currently being negotiated between the two teams.
Alan, it was actually not Donald Trump, it was Ursula von der Leyen who said this was the biggest deal ever made in the world. She knows Donald Trump likes his superlatives. Would you agree with that? Tell us what this all means for the two countries and for the global economy.
Well, it's certainly a large deal because the US and European Union are the two largest economic entities on this planet. So yes, it's a very big deal. I would also point out that that the European Commission president noted that the trade relationship is highly unbalanced currently, and that's in Europe's favor. She said that that situation is unsustainable. And in my view, she's absolutely right. And I think she deserves great credit for taking steps to rebalance that and to make it much more sustainable. It's also very important for the entire global economy because it seems to me, at least, although we haven't seen too many specifics regarding this deal, but it seems to me to further isolate China, which for 2 or 3 decades now has been the major threat to a truly viable and sustainable global trading system. We have to remember that nearly all of President Trump's prior trade deals have included what you might call anti-China provisions, designed to keep China out of the various manufacturing and other supply chains that make up commerce between those various trading partners. I didn't see an explicit so-called anti-China provision so far in this European trade deal, but certainly in an economically diplomatic sense, if I can use that term, it does isolate China further, and it does certainly set back China's ambitions to rally the rest of the world against what it keeps calling American trade and economic bullying.
Mujtaba, I mean, did the EU have any other cards it could have used? It is 27 countries. It is a huge trading bloc. I believe there's something called the anti-coercion instrument, a rule created with China in mind that means it really could have inflicted real harm on the US if it wanted to threaten that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that the European Union is a player when it comes to trade, and they could have retaliated not only with respect to goods exports, and the EU had worked up around 100 billion worth of goods retaliation, so that could have constrained US goods access to the European single market had the Commission decided to go down that route. But also, as you allude to, we have instruments in the European Union now that would also allow the EU to constrain US service exports to the single market. And that's important because the US has a trade surplus in its trade with the European Union when it comes to services. So that really would have hurt Donald Trump and his administration, and indeed the US economy, had the EU moved in that direction. But again, I think the problem for von der Leyen was the bigger picture. This wasn't a classical trade negotiation. It wasn't about we've got to respond in kind to what the Americans are doing, but to take into account the broader considerations, which, as I say, relate to NATO, relate to Ukraine, relate to the broader set of considerations that bind the two sides together. And it's in that regard, and with those considerations in mind, that drove, I think, the Commission's risk aversion and indeed the more cautious approach. Now what the Commission will try to do is negotiate from this 15% tariff wall as much away as possible. There are already certain sector exemptions they will continue to negotiate to try and effectively turn this tariff wall into Swiss cheese. So a wall that exists in paper but in practice means European exporters are paying a much lower rate than the 15% in practical terms.
Alan, I mean, some might say one of the problems the EU faced here was that Trump was the one that set all the rules. In April, with his Liberation Day, he set the deadline of the 1st of August. He set the parameters, some would say, with the deal with the UK, the trade deal there of 10% tariffs. There was no way the EU was ever going to get anything less than that after that.
There's no question about that. And what this deal, as it has been the case with the various other trade deals that President Trump has signed, it shows that when it comes to the global economy as well as transatlantic security relations, the United States holds all of the big cards. I mean, there's no doubt that European retaliation would have inflicted some damage on the American economy. But the fact is that precisely because the European Union runs such an enormous trade surplus with the United States, the fact that for some strange reason, this high income region full of very affluent consumers is so heavily dependent on exports for its growth, as is the case with so many other countries, and with the United States serving for decades as the market of last resort, there's no question that the European Union would have come out much worse had retaliation begun. So from a U.S. standpoint, I think it's a long overdue and highly welcome change that President Trump has finally realized what kind of leverage the United States has over practically every one of its trading partners, and has decided to use it to press entirely legitimate U.S. economic interests.
And David, when we say that President Trump set all the rules, he set all the rules about the way the meeting worked. It was a very odd backdrop to see a US president holding court at his own residence, but in a foreign land. And he wanted a face-to-face meeting, and we've seen these face-to-face meetings before. Even before they did the deal, he was there with reporters in front of cameras, and we know the risks of that from Ukraine's President Zelensky or South Africa's President Ramaphosa, don't we?
Well, no, I mean, you're absolutely right, James. It's theatre, it's for the cameras, it's for primetime TV, it's the way Trump operates. He even chose to play golf in a non-EU country, and in a way set the terms of the engagement there. So, I mean, it's very, very much, it was the Trump show, and Ursula von der Leyen turned up. But I think in general, if you think of what Europe really wanted out of this deal. No trade war, number one. Open access to American weapons, number two, and open access to American energy, number three. I'm not sure there's a huge amount of consumer goods from America that would be sold in Europe. Certainly, Europeans aren't gagging to buy American consumer goods. But in terms of strategy, Europe now has the backing of the United States in terms of weapons. It has the backing of the United States in terms of energy. Both of those are going to be very valuable in the ongoing proximate war with Russia. And most European countries will have their products tariffed, but those tariffs are going to be paid, let's not forget, by Americans, not by Europeans. And so I think the trade negotiations are very long-term events, right? They are things that you've got to think, is it a zero-sum game? If I lose, you win, and vice versa? No. In fact, in this case, both sides win. One side goes away with what I would call a media victory, and the other side goes away with a geostrategic victory. At the end of the day, most Europeans don't care about whether we run a trade surplus with the United States or not. That is not an electoral issue. What is an electoral issue would be a falling out with the United States and a weaning off American energy and onto, let's say, Russian energy or Middle Eastern energy. So if you look at it in the totality, you're absolutely right. It was very Trumpian. We'll go to a golf course, I'll sit down, I'll boss the meeting. But in terms of the outcome, Europeans actually got what they wanted. So for the world economy, this is all good, guys. This is all good.
Mujtaba, would you agree with that? I mean, it's not just about trade. It goes beyond trade. Ursula von der Leyen was thinking about Ukraine. She was thinking about things that normally Europe would take for granted from the United States, their support as an ally.
Yes, I mean, I agree with David that geostrategy is perhaps the right way to frame what the Commission was attempting to do here. As I say, this wasn't a pure trade negotiation. There were other bits of the puzzle the Commission was mindful of, not least what happens with respect to Ukraine and NATO. Perhaps where I disagree with David is now taking this trade agreement and extrapolating around what the US-EU relationship may look like going forward. I think there are still very material risks to that relationship for the rest of this year and indeed into next. I'll talk about a few. I mean, there are very serious concerns about Greenland and what the US administration's designs are with respect to Greenland. Senior Danish officials are of the view something funny is going to happen there, unclear when, unclear what form it will take, but that is absolutely a risk where I think the administration has very cohesive and coherent views about enlarging the map, and so that's a major strategic risk between the two sides. I think there are lots of concerns also when it comes to potential electoral interference. So this isn't about policy, it's about the politics. It's about MAGA, Make America Great Again, connecting to far-right insurgents within the European Union to support them through elections. And of course, there is one very consequential election in the first half of next year in Hungary, where incumbent Viktor Orban looks as though he may lose. And so what role, if any, will the US play in that election to support and to bolster Orban? I think that remains, a real serious concern. Later on this year, as I said, the US is going to decide which assets it will leave in Europe and which assets it wants to draw down and reposition to focus on the big confrontation the US is concerned about, which is with China in the Indo-Pacific, that review may surprise to the downside. We may get a greater rotation of US troops out of Europe. We may have strategic enablers. These are things that allow European forces to fight, be effective, that protect European democracies. We may see those drawn down more aggressively. And then there are other things, even with the trade agreement, there are risks, for example, with respect to the pharmaceutical sector. When these 232 investigations conclude later down the line, that may mean further tariffs when it comes to sectoral trade between the EU and the US. And there are also, questions about whether the EU can actually buy the 250 billion in energy they're committing to buy every year for the next 3 years. I mean, can the EU actually do that? And if they don't do that, may the US respond? And so I'm quite concerned still about the overarching picture between the two sides going forward.
David, I mean, you and Mujtaba both seem to think this is the best deal that could have been done, but it's pretty clear there are voices even at the highest level. I mean, Viktor Orban is normally against most of what the European Union does, even though his country, Hungary, is a member. But he said Donald Trump ate von der Leyen for breakfast. He said the US president is a heavyweight when it comes to negotiations, while Madam President is a featherweight. I mean, this shows, I think, he perhaps would be expected to say that, but Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, I support this trade agreement, but I do so without any enthusiasm. I mean, do you think some of these leaders don't like the fact that an unelected official, unelected by the mass population, is negotiating with President Trump?
Well, I think, it's the Christine Keeler test with respect to Orban. He would say that, wouldn't she? Which is what she said about John Profumo at the trial. Orban would say that because he doesn't like the EU, okay? And as I said at the very, very start, there is an ongoing battle between the member states and the European Commission, between the forces of federalism within the United States, or within the European Union, which are largely based around the Commission, and the forces of separatism and or nationalism, and or just member states' domestic politics, which always comes into play when there's a crisis. So basically you have the Council, which represents the European member states, vis-a-vis the Commission. And an example of this is exactly what has happened. It's very, very clear that France has different interests to Germany. Germany has different interests to Italy. Small countries like Ireland have different interests. And of course, as Mukhtar says, Denmark is worried about Greenland in a way in which most other European member states are not. So
OK, let me bring in Alan again, if you don't mind, because I would like to get to this point, which is the whole Donald Trump tariff strategy, which many economists mocked and said was not going to work.
Most economists mocked.
Yeah. Do you think it is working, or do you think those threats that they talked about, recession and inflation, are still worries going down the line?
So far, it seems to be working very well, not only because there's no sign of any U.S. recession on the horizon, not only because there's been virtually no U.S. inflation that can be attributed to tariffs thus far. And we have to remember that the so-called trade war considerations have been at a play and have been on people's minds for more than 6 months now, and to have no inflation, whatever, practically speaking, that's a really major achievement. And what that tells me is that U.S. businesses understand that after years of high inflation under former President Biden, Americans are simply not going to stand for many major price hikes going down the road.
Mujtaba, would you agree with that? The vast majority of economists said this tariff policy wasn't going to work, but Trump was right, they were wrong.
No, I disagree. I think it's too early. It's correct, I think, to suggest and to argue that the Trump administration is collecting more tariff revenues as a result of the policies they're now implementing, and that is creating a bit more fiscal space for the administration. But I think some of the negative implications, in particular with respect to inflation, I don't think we've yet seen in the data. And to my mind, I suspect at some point we are going to see that in the data. I find it inconceivable to believe the administration can resurrect tariff wars with all of its trading partners in the order of what they're doing with the EU, and that not ultimately have an implication regarding domestic inflation. And so I think we will ultimately see that reflected in the data, albeit we've not seen that at the moment.
David, of course, we still have other deals which have not been done, many other deals. The big ones are the neighbours, Mexico and Canada, and then perhaps the other most important one clearly is China, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. But I think let's remind the viewers what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax on the country that imposes the tariffs, on either the consumers and or the producers. I mean, ultimately, no European will pay this direct tariff at all. And I think people really have to understand that is what a tariff is. It is a tax on domestic people.
There's no question.
In order to change their, sorry, just 1 second, in order to change their behavior. That's what it is. So I think that with respect to Mexico and Canada, we're talking about, what we regard that as North America. Okay, we regard the Mexican, the NAFTA, Canadian, American deal as something we've seen for the last 30 odd years. Whether or not Mexico can react, or whether or not Mexico sees what the European Union did and says, look, that's the way forward, rather than the Mark Carney approach, I'm not so sure. But clearly this will have a dislocative effect on the United States economy, simply because the last 30 years have been set up differently.
Thank you very much.
A dislocative effect
very quickly,
on foreign
Alan.
Economies. It has more of a dislocative effect on foreign economies because they're so heavily dependent on exporting to the United States. And if they wind up exporting less, then their companies wind up selling less, they hire fewer workers, wages go down. That's why we all seem to agree that the United States holds all the major economic cards in these trading relationships.
Alan, thank you. I said quickly, we have to end it there. Thank you to our guests today, David McWilliams, Alan Tonelson and Mujtaba Rahman. If you came in late and want to see this programme again, you can watch it whenever you want on YouTube or at our website, aljazeera.com. As ever, we'd like your views, your opinions, and if you must, your complaints too, post them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X. Just look for @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the production team here in Doha. Stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.